No one in the town of Ashridge could say exactly when the girl first appeared on the edge of the boardwalk, because she did not arrive with noise or urgency or announcement. She simply became part of the landscape, as unnoticed at first as a fence post or a forgotten crate, sitting quietly near the old mercantile with her back against the wall and her knees pulled close to her chest. She was small for her age, her limbs thin in a way that spoke not of sickness but of long days without enough food, and her dress, once blue by the look of it, had faded into a tired gray that blended with the dust of the street. She sat there every morning, and when evening came she was still there, watching the road that cut through town as if it were the only thing in the world that mattered. Ashridge was not a cruel town, but it was a tired one. People rose before sunrise and worked until their bodies ached, and when they passed the girl, they did so with eyes trained forward and thoughts fixed on survival. The butcher noticed her once and left a scrap of bread beside the steps without a word. The schoolteacher paused on the first day, opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again and walked on. The preacher told himself the child must belong to someone nearby, because believing that made it easier to keep moving. Everyone assumed there was a story that would explain her presence, and because of that assumption, no one stopped long enough to hear it. The girl believed in her story with the unshakable certainty only children possess. Her name was Eliza May Harper, and her father had told her to wait. He had knelt in front of her 3 weeks earlier, his hands rough and trembling as he brushed her hair back from her face, and he had promised her that this waiting would not last long. He said he had found work beyond the hills, that he would return with money, food, and a place where the cold could not reach her bones. Eliza believed him not because the promise was convenient, but because he was her father, and fathers did not lie about coming back. So she waited, day after day, counting mornings by the way the light shifted across the street and nights by the ache in her stomach. Winter crept closer with quiet determination. The wind carried the bite of frost, and Eliza's fingers grew stiff as she clutched the hem of her dress, rubbing the fabric between her hands to keep herself anchored. She had learned how to make herself small, how to conserve warmth by staying still, how to ignore the way hunger made her dizzy when she stood too quickly. Each day she told herself that tomorrow would be the day she saw her father coming down the road, his hat pulled low, his shoulders tired but his smile wide with relief. That belief kept her there long after logic might have sent her elsewhere. On the 20th morning, the town changed in a way no one noticed at first. A man rode in from the west just after sunrise, his horse moving with the slow, deliberate gait of an animal that had traveled far without rest. The man sat easily in the saddle, but there was weariness in the way his shoulders sloped forward, and the dust clinging to his coat told a story of long roads and few destinations. His name was Samuel Boone, though few people would ever learn it, and he had spent most of his life passing through places without leaving anything behind. Samuel had learned early that stopping meant questions, and questions led to attachments, and attachments made leaving hurt. So he worked when he needed to, slept where he could, and moved on before anyone expected him to stay. That morning, his thoughts were fixed on simple things: a hot meal, a stable for his horse, and maybe a few days of work before the road called him again. He had no intention of noticing the girl on the boardwalk, and yet something in his chest tightened as his horse slowed without command. He saw her the way one notices a wrong note in a familiar song, subtle but impossible to ignore once heard. She was too still, too quiet for a child, her gaze locked on the road with a patience that felt older than her years. Samuel dismounted and tied his horse, telling himself he was only stopping for supplies, that the girl was none of his concern. But his boots carried him closer anyway, each step heavier than the last. Eliza did not look up when he stopped in front of her. She had learned that most people did not stay long enough to matter, and she conserved her hope carefully, like something fragile that could shatter if handled too often. Samuel stood there longer than he intended, noticing details he wished he could unsee: the way her shoes were cracked and thin, the way her lips were dry from cold and thirst, the faint tremor in her hands that had nothing to do with fear. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked finally, his voice gentler than he meant it to be. She looked up then, and her eyes were startlingly clear, wide and steady in a face far too thin. "My papa," she said without hesitation, as if the answer had been waiting just beneath the surface. Something settled heavily in Samuel's chest. He crouched to her level, resting his arms on his knees. "How long have you been waiting?" She considered the question seriously, her brow furrowing as she counted. "A long while. Miss Carter says it's been almost 3 weeks." 3 weeks. Samuel glanced down the road she watched so faithfully, then back at the girl. "Did he say where he went?" "He went to work," she replied, pride softening her voice. "He said he'd come back when he had enough for us." Samuel inhaled slowly, recognizing the moment for what it was. Some moments passed without consequence. Others changed everything. This one belonged to the second kind. "Have you eaten today?" he asked. Eliza shook her head, then added quietly, "Not since yesterday." Samuel stood, already reaching into his pocket. "There's a place across the street," he said, nodding toward the small cafe with steam fogging its windows. "You can sit where you can see the road. If your papa comes, you'll see him first." She hesitated, glancing back at the spot where she had waited so long, then at Samuel's face. "You promise?" "I promise." She slipped her hand into his, and the cold of her skin startled him more than anything else that morning. Inside the cafe, warmth wrapped around them like a forgotten memory. The woman behind the counter paused when she saw the girl, her expression softening with something like relief. Eliza ate slowly at first, as if afraid the food might vanish if she moved too quickly, then faster as hunger overruled caution. Samuel watched her in silence, the weight of a question pressing down on him with every bite she took. What happened to a child when waiting was all she had left? Outside, snow began to fall, light and quiet, and Samuel Boone realized that by stopping, by asking one simple question, he had already stepped off the road he thought he was following. The truth that came with the snow ***. Samuel Boone did not sleep that night, not truly. He lay on a narrow cot in the back room of the cafe, staring up at the low ceiling while the sounds of the building settled around him, the soft creak of old wood and the faint whistle of wind slipping through cracks in the walls. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Eliza sitting on the steps again, her small body folded inward as if she could disappear into herself if she tried hard enough, her eyes fixed on a road that had given her nothing but silence. He had ridden away from towns before without looking back, leaving behind faces and places that blurred together over time, but the weight of this one pressed into him differently, heavier and sharper, like a stone lodged in his chest that refused to be ignored. Morning came slow and pale, the sky washed clean by fresh snow that softened the hard edges of Ashridge. Samuel rose before the cafe opened and stepped outside, the cold biting through his coat as he took in the quiet street. The world looked peaceful in the way it often did before revealing its cruelty, and for a brief moment he wished the snow could cover everything long enough for a child to be safe simply by existing. When he returned inside, Eliza was already awake, sitting at a small table with her hands wrapped around a cup of warm milk, her feet swinging just above the floor. She looked up when she saw him, her expression careful, hopeful in a way that made him uncomfortable because hope was fragile, and he had learned how easily it broke. "Did you sleep?" he asked, though the question felt inadequate. She nodded, even though the dark shadows beneath her eyes told a different story. "I dreamed he came back," she said simply, not accusing, not pleading, just stating a fact as children often did. Samuel felt the words settle into him like frost. He had known, from the moment he asked his first question, that the road might not bring good answers, but knowing something and facing it were very different things. After breakfast, Samuel saddled his horse and rode out beyond the edge of town, following the same road Eliza watched every day, the one that curved toward the hills where men went looking for work and sometimes did not return. He told himself he was only asking questions, only gathering information, but deep down he knew he was searching for the truth, whatever shape it took, because a lie, even a gentle one, would only extend the waiting that had already stolen too much from a child who deserved more. The ranch sat several miles out, its fences half buried in snow, its barns weathered but solid. A man with a lined face and steady eyes met him near the corral, his breath clouding the cold air as he studied Samuel with the practiced gaze of someone who measured people quickly and accurately. They spoke of work first, of horses and repairs and the hard winter ahead, and only then did Samuel ask the question that tightened his chest. The man's expression shifted, his jaw setting as if bracing against a familiar pain, and he nodded slowly, as though he had been expecting the question all along. Yes, the rancher said, his voice low and heavy, there was a man. Took a job here a few weeks back. Strong worker. Quiet. Said he had a little girl waiting in town. The world seemed to tilt slightly, the cold seeping deeper into Samuel's bones. What happened to him, he asked, though some part of him already knew the answer. The rancher exhaled, looking away toward the distant hills. Horse spooked. Threw him bad. He didn't suffer long. He paused, then added softly, his name was Daniel Harper. The name echoed in Samuel's mind like a bell struck too hard. He thanked the man and rode back toward Ashridge with a weight that felt impossible to carry, the snow falling thicker now, blurring the road ahead as if the world itself did not want him to see where he was going. Every step of the journey felt like a betrayal, every moment bringing him closer to a truth that would shatter the small, fierce hope he had seen in Eliza's eyes. By the time he reached town, lanterns glowed in windows, casting warm squares of light against the growing dark. Eliza sat just inside the cafe doorway, bundled in a borrowed coat, her eyes lifting the instant she saw him. She stood, her small body tense with expectation, and Samuel dismounted slowly, each movement deliberate as though moving too quickly might break something already fragile. "Did you find him?" she asked, her voice steady but thin, stretched tight with hope. Samuel knelt in front of her, bringing himself to her level the way he had before, but this time there was no easy reassurance waiting in his chest. He took a breath, the kind that filled his lungs and weighed down his heart. "Eliza," he said gently, "your papa did exactly what he said he would do. He went to work, trying to make things better for you." Her eyes brightened for a heartbeat, then faltered as she saw his expression. "But," she whispered. "But there was an accident," Samuel continued, his voice steady even as something inside him fractured. "He didn't come back." The silence that followed was deep and absolute, swallowing the sounds of the town, the wind, even the falling snow. Eliza stared at him, her face empty of understanding at first, as though the words had not yet found a place to land. Then she shook her head slowly, once, then again, as if correcting a mistake. "No," she said quietly. "He promised." Samuel felt the truth press against him, unforgiving and sharp. "I know," he said, and meant it more deeply than he could explain. The moment broke then, not with anger or screaming, but with a sound so raw and sudden it tore through him. Eliza's shoulders shook as she folded inward, grief pouring out of her in waves too large for her small body to hold. Samuel wrapped his arms around her, holding her as the world continued on around them, indifferent and unchanged, while everything inside her collapsed. He did not tell her to be strong. He did not tell her it would be all right. He simply stayed, anchoring her to something solid in a moment when nothing felt certain. That night, Eliza slept fitfully, waking from dreams where footsteps never reached her, and Samuel sat beside her bed, watching her chest rise and fall, wondering how a man became responsible for a life simply by stopping when everyone else walked past. He thought of the road, of the years he had spent moving without belonging, and for the first time he understood that some journeys did not lead forward or backward, but inward, toward choices that could not be undone. Morning brought cold light and hard questions. Eliza sat quietly at the table, pushing food around her plate without eating, her eyes distant. "What happens to me now?" she asked finally, the question simple and devastating in its honesty. Samuel did not pretend to have answers he did not possess. He only knew one thing with certainty as he looked at the child who had waited longer than any child should. "You won't be waiting alone," he said, and in that moment, the road he had followed for so long finally began to disappear behind him. The choice that bound two lives together ****. The days that followed did not move forward in a straight line, because grief rarely allowed such simplicity. Time in Ashridge seemed to stretch and fold back on itself, mornings arriving cold and gray, evenings settling heavy and quiet, and in between them a little girl learning how to exist in a world where waiting no longer made sense. Eliza moved through those days like someone navigating unfamiliar ground, cautious with every step, unsure which places were safe to stand on and which might crumble beneath her feet. She no longer watched the road with the same fierce devotion, but her eyes still drifted there sometimes, as if part of her had not yet accepted that no figure would ever appear at its end. Samuel noticed these moments and felt a quiet ache settle inside him, not sharp like guilt, but deep like responsibility. He spent his mornings speaking with people who claimed to know how things were done when a child was left without parents. The sheriff offered sympathy but little else, explaining rules and procedures in a voice that sounded practiced, worn thin by repetition. The preacher spoke of faith and endurance, of trust in a larger plan, but could not say where Eliza would sleep when winter fully arrived. The schoolteacher listened the longest, her eyes soft and tired, and admitted that children like Eliza often vanished into places where their names became numbers and their stories faded into silence. Each conversation ended the same way, with Samuel thanking them and walking away feeling that the world had offered explanations instead of solutions. Eliza rarely spoke during these discussions, but she watched everything, absorbing more than anyone realized. Children learn quickly when they had to, and she understood that decisions were being made about her life by people who did not truly see her. One evening, as the sky darkened early and the cold pressed against the windows, she asked Samuel a question that had been forming quietly inside her for days. She asked it without tears or fear, only with the calm seriousness that had become her shield. "Am I going somewhere else?" she said, not looking at him, her fingers tracing slow circles on the table's worn surface. Samuel felt the weight of the question settle over him like a final test. He had told himself many times that he was only helping until someone better suited stepped forward, someone with roots and certainty and a place already prepared. But as he looked at Eliza, small and steady in her borrowed coat, he realized that waiting for someone else to take responsibility was the same mistake everyone in Ashridge had already made. He knelt beside her chair, meeting her gaze directly, refusing to soften the truth with false reassurance. "I don't know what tomorrow looks like yet," he said carefully, "but I do know you won't be sent away without a choice. Not if I have anything to say about it." She studied his face with the same careful attention she once gave the road, as if searching for cracks where a promise might fail. "You won't leave me," she said, not as a question, but as a fragile declaration she needed him to confirm. Samuel had spent years avoiding promises because he understood their power. A promise shaped the future, bound actions to words, and once spoken, it could not be taken back without cost. He thought of the road stretching endlessly ahead, of nights spent alone under open skies, of the freedom he once believed was everything. Then he thought of Eliza sitting on cold steps, believing in a promise that had never been broken by choice, only by fate. Something shifted inside him then, quiet but permanent. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, and felt the truth of it settle into his bones. The decision did not arrive with ceremony or applause. There was no single moment where everything became clear. Instead, it unfolded slowly, built from small, deliberate actions that left no room for retreat. Samuel took work at a ranch outside town, a place with steady labor and a small cabin that had stood empty for years. It was not grand, but it was solid, with walls thick enough to keep out the worst of the cold and a hearth that could be coaxed into warmth with patience. When he told Eliza about it, her eyes widened, not with excitement, but with cautious curiosity, as if she were afraid to imagine something lasting. They rode out together on a cold morning, Eliza seated carefully in front of him, wrapped in layers that made her look smaller rather than larger. The town faded behind them, its familiar shapes blurring into white as snow fell softly, and Samuel felt a strange sense of finality with every step his horse took away from Ashridge. Eliza looked back once, then turned forward again, her small hand gripping his coat as if anchoring herself to the present. She did not ask if they would return. Some part of her already knew that waiting belonged to the past. The cabin stood at the edge of the ranch, weathered but strong, smoke curling faintly from the chimney as if welcoming them. Eliza approached it slowly, her movements careful, her eyes scanning every detail. Inside, the space was simple and quiet, filled with the scent of pine and old wood. Samuel showed her the small room at the back, its narrow bed and single window overlooking the fields. "This can be yours," he said, unsure how the words would land. She stepped inside, touching the wall lightly, then the bed, then the window, as if confirming that everything was real. "Mine," she repeated softly, and the word seemed to change shape as it settled into the room, turning from a question into something closer to truth. Life did not become easy simply because a choice had been made. Eliza woke from nightmares, calling for a father who would never answer, and Samuel learned how to sit with grief rather than trying to fix it. He learned when to speak and when silence was the kinder response. Days were filled with work, with mending fences and caring for animals, and Eliza followed him at first, watching closely, learning the rhythms of the ranch and the language of responsibility. Slowly, she began to laugh again, startled at first by the sound as if it belonged to someone else, then more freely as the days passed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft gold, a man rode up to the cabin with an expression sharp enough to cut. He introduced himself as family, distant but entitled, and spoke of blood and obligation as though they were currency to be claimed. Samuel listened without interruption, his posture calm but unyielding, and when the man finished, Samuel spoke with a steadiness that surprised even him. He spoke of absence, of 16 days on cold steps, of a child learning to survive while adults looked away. Eliza stood beside him, small but unafraid, and when she spoke, her voice carried a certainty no argument could undo. "I choose him," she said simply. The man left angry and empty-handed, and the dust settled behind him as the evening grew quiet again. Samuel and Eliza stood together in the fading light, neither speaking, both understanding that something final had just occurred. It was not a victory celebrated with joy, but a boundary drawn with care, protecting something fragile and precious. That night, as the fire crackled low and the world outside lay hushed beneath snow and stars, Eliza leaned against Samuel's side and whispered something he had not expected to hear. "I don't want to wait anymore," she said, her voice small but firm. Samuel closed his eyes briefly, feeling the truth of those words settle into him. Neither did he. And in that quiet understanding, a drifter and a child found themselves standing still for the first time, bound not by blood, but by choice, and by the courage it took to stop when everyone else had walked past. No longer waiting, finally home ***. Spring did not arrive all at once at the edge of the ranch, but when it came, it did so with quiet persistence, melting the last stubborn traces of snow and coaxing green from ground that had long seemed unwilling to give anything back. Eliza noticed the change before Samuel did. She was the one who pointed out the first blade of grass pushing through the dirt, the first bird returning to the fence line, the first morning when the cold did not cling quite so tightly to her bones. Each small sign of renewal seemed to speak to her in a language she understood instinctively, as if the land itself were reminding her that nothing stayed frozen forever, not even grief. With the coming of warmer days, Eliza began to change in ways that were subtle at first but undeniable over time. The sharp edges of hunger faded from her face, replaced by a softness that came from regular meals and steady care. Her eyes, once guarded and distant, grew brighter, curious again, and the heavy silence she carried loosened its grip. She still spoke of her father sometimes, not with the raw ache of loss, but with the gentler sadness of memory, sharing stories Samuel had never heard, moments that made her smile even as they brought tears to her eyes. Samuel listened to every word, understanding that remembering was not something to be avoided, but honored. Samuel himself changed too, though he noticed it less readily. The restlessness that had once defined him softened, replaced by a steady sense of purpose that surprised him with its quiet strength. The ranch owner saw it as well, offering him more responsibility, trusting him with decisions that shaped the land and the work done upon it. Samuel accepted those responsibilities not as burdens, but as proof that staying, truly staying, was not the loss of freedom he had once feared, but the creation of something far more meaningful. Each day ended not with the emptiness of another place left behind, but with the simple satisfaction of returning home. Eliza began attending the small schoolhouse near the ranch, riding with Samuel each morning and sitting tall in the saddle, her laughter carried on the wind as they traveled the familiar path. At first, she was quiet among the other children, watching more than speaking, but soon she found her place, sharing pencils and secrets, learning letters and numbers, discovering worlds hidden in books that promised adventures without abandonment. The teacher noticed her determination, the way she approached learning as something precious, and often caught her lingering after lessons, eager to understand just a little more. There were still difficult days, moments when grief returned without warning, when Eliza woke from dreams where she was small again, waiting on cold steps with the road stretching endlessly before her. On those mornings, Samuel did not rush her or dismiss her fears. He sat with her, steady and present, reminding her with actions rather than words that she was no longer alone. He learned that healing did not mean erasing the past, but building something strong enough to carry it. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold and amber across the open fields, Eliza stood beside Samuel outside the cabin, watching the horizon with a thoughtful expression. "I used to think waiting was my job," she said quietly, her voice steady but reflective. "Like if I waited long enough, everything would be okay." She paused, then turned to him, her eyes filled with a wisdom far beyond her years. "But now I think living is my job." The word struck Samuel harder than any truth he had learned on the road. In that moment, he understood fully what had been given to both of them, not as a gift from fate, but as the result of a single choice made when it would have been easier to walk past. He knelt beside her, meeting her gaze, and nodded. "You're right," he said softly. "And you're doing a fine job of it." As the seasons turned, the ranch flourished, not just in crops and livestock, but in spirit. Eliza grew stronger, more confident, her laughter becoming a familiar sound woven into the daily rhythms of work and rest. Samuel watched her with quiet pride, never claiming a title he had not been given, yet fulfilling the role with a devotion that needed no name. The bond between them was not defined by blood or law, but by something far more enduring: choice, commitment, and the courage to care. Years later, when travelers passed near the ranch and stopped for water or rest, they sometimes noticed a young girl helping with chores, her posture confident, her smile easy. They noticed a man nearby, calm and grounded, watching her with a protective warmth that spoke volumes without words. They did not know the story of cold steps and long waiting, of promises broken by fate but fulfilled by compassion. They only saw the result of a moment when someone chose to stop. Eliza would sometimes stand at the edge of the road then, not to wait, but to watch the world pass with a sense of belonging that had once seemed impossible. She understood now that not everyone would stop, and that was all right. What mattered was that one person had, and that one choice had changed everything. She was no longer the girl everyone walked past. She was someone who had been seen, chosen, and loved, and because of that, she carried the quiet certainty that even in a world that often hurried by, a single act of kindness could become a home. And so the road continued on, stretching endlessly beyond the horizon, but for Eliza and Samuel, it was no longer something to chase or fear. It was simply there, a reminder of where they had come from and how far they had traveled, not in miles, but in heart. Waiting was over. Living had begun.